Good afternoon and welcome to this briefing by the Jerusalem Press Club. I'm Jonathan Beck, Director of Content. It's been less than 48 hours since President Donald J. Trump was sworn into office, and from the pace of things, it seems very much like the second Trump administration wants to hit the ground running, if I would borrow a phrase from the Obama administration. This has been evident in a series of executive orders signed by Trump, as well as by some headline-producing behavior, like his decision to lift the security detail from former NSC advisor John Bolton, with whom he had a falling out during the last administration, the style with which he decided to fire for Biden-era officials on social media with your fire, like on his TV show The Apprentice. And finally, there's also controversies surrounding some of his inner circle, like the was it or was it not a Nazi salute by Elon Musk during the swearing-in ceremony on Monday, um, a, a gesture open to interpretation. Our guest today to discuss these issues is Professor Jonathan Rynhold, an expert on US-Israeli relations, Israeli foreign policy, and the role of political culture in foreign policy. Professor Rynhold is head of the Department of Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University. He's also a senior researcher at BESA, the BESA Center for Strategic Studies. He received his PhD from LSE, the London School of Economics and International Relations, in 1998. And in 2012-2013 was Schusterman Visiting Professor of Israeli Politics at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. His book about the Arab-Israeli conflict in American political culture, with his headline published by Cambridge University Press in 2015, won the annual Israeli Association for Political Science Book Prize. Only yesterday, he published an article on what Israel can expect from the incoming second Trump administration, published in the Israel Journal of Foreign Affairs. So hello, Professor Rynhold, and thank you for joining us.
Hi.
Before we go into the questions, could you present your views of the incoming second Trump administration?
Sure, thank you, Jonathan. So I would say the first thing one has to think about is how does President Trump relate to the three foundations of US-Israeli relations? So the first foundation is a sense of identification with Israel, which comes with values and ideology, and we saw that very clearly with Biden. So that's absent. Trump is a deal maker. He's not emotionally or ideologically linked to Israel, but some of the people around him, notably his daughter and son-in-law, are. The second issue is domestic politics. And in the first administration, the fact that Trump's core constituency, evangelicals, are extremely pro-Israel, meant that he felt the need to keep them on board with the idea of running for a second term. That's no longer relevant. He's not going to be running again. And so the constraint or the influence of that factor and of the donors, pro-Israel donors, no longer exists. So what we're left with is Trump's view of what America's interests are, what their foreign policy interests, their grand strategy. And here again, Trump will be less constrained by the bureaucracy. He's had 4 years experience. He's prepared for this. And as we saw with all those executive orders, he means to act and determine things much more. And he does take advisors and positions of people who are very pro-Israel, but also those who are more critical. And that gives him a nice position in the middle of those two to concern both friends and enemies of Israel, that he may act against them, but in the end, it's up to him. And so he keeps them guessing. From Israel's point of view, there is a problem with the way Trump looks at the world. He is what we might call a belligerent isolationist. That is someone who's in the tradition of Republicans who were against joining the Second World War against Nazi Germany. And that they also use the catchphrase America first. And from Israel's point of view, that's very damaging, because if America takes a step back in the world, and America is the dominant external power in the Middle East, whatever fills that vacuum will be worse. And while President Trump is belligerent, he's willing to use a lot of force to protect the lives of Americans or American territory, he's proven much less willing to protect America's allies. Indeed, he's even suggested leaving NATO and withdrawing American troops from South Korea. They've been there 70 years. So that's an issue for Israel. And when we look at what he said about the increased influence of Turkey in Syria, which is a major concern for Israel, and he said he's absolutely fine with that. It's their problem, it's their issue. He doesn't want to get involved. But there are two things that will be important to him. One is Iran. He's not that bothered about Iranian power, conventional power in the Middle East, but he is concerned about Iranian nuclear power, because ultimately an Iranian nuclear weapon, if it can be fitted with a intercontinental ballistic missile, it can reach America directly. And that makes the Iranian nuclear program a direct concern, though not necessarily an urgent one, because they don't have those intercontinental ballistic missiles, at least not yet. The second issue that will be very important to him is the Abraham Accords, extending normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And there are two things at stake here. One is that Donald Trump is more narcissistic than any previous president, and for his ego reasons, he wants to be the guy to do, the deal of the century, the ultimate deal. And the second reason is that the more Israel normalizes its relations with the Gulf states, the more they can cooperate together to deal with security threats like Iran and like ISIS, the less America has to do. And from Trump's point of view, in the grand scheme of things, he wants America to do less. So I'm going to leave it there and hand back to Jonathan and to his and your questions.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction. I have some, by the way, issues with my screen flickering. I hope the rest of the viewers are not suffering from the same problems and it's just here. I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned the evangelicals. Now, Trump also has a basis, maybe weaker, but with the far right, also flirting with the white supremacist far right. And it seems like this electorate is still with him. I mentioned in the introduction, Elon Musk. Can you tell me what the American Jewish community, how it feels about that, and how it should affect perhaps? I know that Trump is on his second term and he owes nothing to no one, but still there's like an electorate base, and the party continues. So
yeah,
how are they viewing his team and his supporters, including the more racist elements?
Okay, so first of all, even if domestic politics doesn't matter for Trump, it matters for all the Republicans in Congress. They're going to have midterm elections in 2 years and then another in 4 years. So they do need to pay attention to this. And this is important to Israel because when it comes to financial aid, and Trump's spoken about changing the aid that Israel receives from grants to loans, here is where Congress has the most influence. So that's the first thing. The second thing is American Jews feel far more threatened by anti-Semitism than any time, I would say, since the late 1940s. And the amount of attacks on Jewish buildings and Jewish institutions has shot up, and the amount of hostility online to Jews has shot up. Part of this comes from the far right, and American Jews are very concerned about that, but part of it comes from the far left as well, especially as Israel is concerned. And in the last year, that mixture has actually led to an increase in identification with Israel among American Jews. So the problem for American Jews is that they don't know who will be best for them. They know that both sides have bad elements. So when Biden was running, it was very, very clear that from the point of view of anti-Semitism and the point of view of Israel, he was the best candidate as far as American Jews were concerned. But the unknown quantity that was Kamala Harris, the increased influence, the noise coming from the far left of the party, and then you have the same on the right, makes it very difficult for American Jews to see that either party is by far the clearest and best option in terms of anti-Semitism.
Okay, I understand. Can I ask about, you mentioned interests that the administration here has here with Saudi Arabia and the Abraham Accords. Now, we know, even despite things that MBS said in the past about not caring much about the Palestinians, etc., that any Abraham style solution that includes Saudi Arabia passes through the establishment of a Palestinian state. Now, how does the appointment of Mike Huckabee as the ambassador to Israel, who is, you could say he's probably against a two-stage solution, mesh with not just not just the Abraham Accords, but also like the well-known attitude of the State Department of Foggy Bottom, which is the two-state solution is the only solution to the conflict.
Yeah, so in the previous administration, the ambassador to Israel was David Friedman, who's also an opponent of the two-state solution and a supporter of the settlements. It's part of what Donald Trump does. He wants to give those in the Israeli government and supporters of it and opponents of the two-state solution someone that they can sympathize with. But that doesn't mean that he's going to follow their policy. He didn't follow David Friedman's policy, and he's not going to be dictated to by Mike Huckabee either. It's something that makes the evangelicals happy and imbies in what you might call industrial quiet. Yeah, so it means that if he wants to go ahead and do stuff with Israel and Saudi Arabia that involves some kind of movement on the Palestinian issue, he will have quiet until the moment he decides he needs to take it on. He won't have a long-running campaign because they will be, as it were, put to sleep for a while by the presence of people that are sympathetic to their way of viewing things, like Mike Huckabee. I think with the Palestinian issue, it's important to recognize that there is not an expectation that Saudi Arabia will demand the establishment of a Palestinian state within a very short period. Even the Biden administration spoke about an over-the-horizon Palestinian state. It may well be that in some ways, if the Saudis want a security treaty with the US, they'll need a majority in the Senate and they'll need Democrats. And it may well be that to get that majority, Israel would need to give more than it actually needs to give to Saudi Arabia. So that's a kind of something to watch out for. But equally, it may well be that Trump will not want to give the Saudis this treaty and may prefer actually to allow them to enrich uranium on their own territory. That's something to watch out for.
To Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And because those are the two demands that they've made. They want, if Iran can enrich uranium, then we want to be able to enrich uranium. And it's as if they're saying, well, either you give us a security treaty or you let us do the same as the Iranians on Saudi territory. So obviously those are going to be complicated issues for Israel to navigate. And although the Palestinian issue will be difficult extremely difficult for this Israeli government coalition, there is always the possibility that the Palestinian Authority will again not accept whatever Trump is putting forward, and that will relieve the pressure on the Israeli government. Were the Palestinian Authority to agree to whatever Donald Trump puts forward, that will put pressure that I don't think the Israeli government would be able to stand up against. And either the government would fall or there'd be a new coalition or there'd be elections.
I understand. Okay. Continuing about, the Palestinians and Trump and Israel, that kind of triangle. Can you comment on what you expect the administration's conduct will be toward the West Bank and Gaza? Will he? There's Israelis on the right which dream that Trump will allow them to annex parts of the land and to remove the Palestinians from there. And I mean, he actually mentioned Gaza as being a wonderful seaside location. So can you tell us what you think would be his view to Israeli wishes to annex parts of either Gaza or the West Bank area C?
So I think before we talk about that, you have to put all his statements, all his contradictory statements into the following equation. And that is, the more he says extreme things to both sides, the more uncertain both sides are about what he will do. And because of his record of really not caring about the traditional niceties of diplomacy, if he wants Morocco to join the Abraham Accords, he'll recognize West Sahara as Moroccan, never mind international law, never mind American policy. So everyone's terrified of Donald Trump, and that gives him a lot of leverage. I think that keeping alive the idea that he might just agree to Israel annexing this, that, or the other is something designed primarily to put pressure on the Palestinians. I don't think it's his first choice by any means. I think he doesn't really care what goes on between the Israelis and Palestinians, as long as two criteria are met. One, it doesn't drag America into any conflicts. And the second one being, if he has any grandiose plans like the Saudi normalization, it doesn't destroy those. So if Donald Trump sees you as responsible for destroying that, you will be punished. And that, I think, is what's hanging over the Palestinians with the idea of annexation. But equally, if Israel was to annex and the Palestinians are not rejecting Donald Trump, then I think you would see, hell and fire coming in Israel's direction. Because whereas Joe Biden was constrained in how much he pressured Israel by his deep belief and commitment to Israel's security, so he could be very angry with Netanyahu, very annoyed, disagree vehemently, but there's some kind of constraint. There aren't those constraints with Trump, and or at least nobody can be sure that there are those constraints, and therefore his leverage, as we've seen with this ceasefire, is much greater because everyone's terrified he'll just turn against them. And if you're Netanyahu and you've bet the House on the Republicans, then if the Republican president with a Republican majority in both houses of Congress doesn't like what you're doing, you have nowhere to go. If there's a Democratic president, you can go to the Republicans, say, try and pressure the Democratic president. You've got nowhere to go with a Republican president. And in that way, Israel, in a sense, has more to lose than the Palestinians.
Okay, thank you. Can we move now to an issue dear to both Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and also to Trump, is Iran. Iranian enrichment. We remember Netanyahu's speech to Congress some years ago, and we remember Trump pulling out of the JCPOA, the joint agreement between Iran and the international community. And I mean, the jury is still out whether the US pulling out of the JCPOA in the long run was a good thing, because now Iran is left to its own devices and it can do whatever it wants. People claim that the agreement actually held some oversight over it. Can you tell me what you think the new administration is gonna, how it's gonna behave toward Iran? Will it rejoin the agreement? Will it revise the agreement or keep the status quo as it is?
They will not be rejoining the JCPOA. If Iran wouldn't do it under Biden, and if the Biden administration no longer thought that that was even worthwhile, then there's no way that Trump is going to be softer than they are. And I think that also tells us something deeper about how America's looking at Iran. So it's clear that for President Trump, a better deal, one that is more constraining of Iran, is something that he would prefer. The tweet that he retweeted about Netanyahu being a warmonger who's going to drag America into wars is a way of telling Netanyahu that's not going to happen. And if you do that, then I'm going to call you out. But that doesn't mean he's not actually prepared to back an Israeli military strike. All the rumbustious, language that comes out is designed to pressure the Iranians and to let them know that there's a really serious chance that America will either attack directly or will support Israel. And that's something that the Biden administration a couple of weeks ago made public, that they were considering that. So I think for the Trump administration, they will be looking to have a tougher deal and to correct some of the elements of the JCPOA that were recognized at the time and are now even more relevant. And that is constraints on missile development, not just enrichment, and very invasive procedures for checking whether they're committed to the rules. If you're America, the missile issue is particularly important because ultimately that's the element that can turn an Iranian nuclear weapon from a threat to the Middle East and Europe to a direct threat to America. Not that Iran doesn't pose enough economic threats, that it could block the Persian Gulf, but that's the big one. I think that there will be pressure on the Iranians to come to a deal within a year because there are a number of factors that make attacking Iran much easier than it was and more, seem like a better option than it did. So if you're President Trump and the FBI has told you that the Iranians tried to assassinate you twice, that's going to influence your willingness to use force against Iran, particularly if you're Donald Trump and you take these things very personally. The second thing is that Israel hit Iran twice. It's knocked out its air defense system. And everyone in America has suddenly come to the view that Iran isn't the big, powerful, dangerous country that they thought it was. Hezbollah being completely, decimated, Iran's ally in Syria. Trump could come to an arrangement with Russia over Ukraine and totally isolate the Iranians. So what that means is that, an Israeli strike back by America or America direct action is a real possibility. And it's something the Iranians have to worry about. And the Americans are concerned that since the Iranians know that, they may rush towards the bomb. And if they rush towards the bomb, then I think that it is actually likely that America would back an Israeli strike. And the clock will be ticking because they'll be thinking about how long will it take for Iran to recover its ability to defend itself? How far away are they from enriching that uranium to 90%? How far away are they from putting it on a missile? All these sorts of things leave a ticking clock, which means that I think it'll be very hard for the Iranians to stretch it out the whole of the Trump administration without making more concessions than they did last time.
Okay, thank you for this. Let's move on to some other countries in the region. I would like to ask you what you think Trump will do, if anything at all, regarding the Houthis in Yemen. And secondly, what about Qatar? Qatar has been is holding American forces, etc. It's been a friend to America, and I think any person with eyes in their head sees as Qatar has been playing a very dual role over the past few months.
Yeah, so the Houthis. So within the administration, the more hawkish pro-Israel elements have been very critical of the Biden administration for allowing the Houthis to continue to disrupt international trade. Egypt's lost, I think it's over $9 billion in fees for the Suez Canal. Everything becomes more expensive in the world if shipping has to go around the Horn of Africa instead of through the Suez Canal. Donald Trump can look at this two ways, and I think that his natural instinct is not to get involved. But I think that the case can be made by those in the administration who believe that there should be a tougher approach, that this is critical to maintaining trade, which is in America's interest, and that really this can only be done by America. But I think there will be a debate in the administration between that view and the view that we don't want to get bogged down in another country. So that's something to watch. It's not clear to me exactly where policy will fall. On Qatar, you have to remember that Qatar, aside from funding terrorism, but you must remember at the behest of Benjamin Netanyahu, They also are home to the largest American military base in the Middle East. And believe it or not, that base was also involved in defending Israel when Iran attacked on both occasions. So Qatar has a complicated role. And I think to begin with, they will do whatever Donald Trump tells them to do because they will not want a confrontation with him. And then I think so long as they don't, publicly humiliate the president or do something that he feels goes against what he told them, then I think he'll, just look at them in terms of benign neglect and using them perhaps as a conduit here and there. I don't think that he will want to get involved in all these kind of local disputes between the UAE and Saudi Arabia versus Qatar and all of that. He'd rather stay out of all of that. So unless they are seen to be involved in destroying one of his policies, like the Abraham Accords with Saudi Arabia, or targeting Americans or passing weapons or finance to people who target Americans, I think that Qatar, there'll be a lot of noise in Congress against it, but I don't think the president will be looking to sort of for a conflict there.
Okay, and my last questions, unless any more questions come from reporters while you answer it, is about the new player on the playground, the new Syria. Do Israel and America's interests regarding the new Syria mesh, considering what you said about Erdogan? And also, I would just like to throw in the mix some, not perhaps unexpected, but at least peculiar voices coming out of southern Syria, deep inside Sueda, about 70 kilometers from the border, of Druze residents saying to Gideon Sa'ar, come and save us from the new regime. So where does Trump fit into all this?
So here again, we see a split in the administration. So there's the isolationist instinct of Trump and of the vice president versus the more assertive leadership thinking of other people that are going to be dealing with the Middle East, including the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. What happened last time in the last administration is Trump wanted to withdraw, but he accepted the argument that the then 800 American forces in Syria prevented ISIS re-emerging by protecting the Kurds from the Turks. And the added issue now is that the presence of the Americans, both there in and around the Kurdish area and on the border with Jordan, is something that can stop Iran smuggling weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon through Syria. So they will make the case that for those reasons, this could threaten the Abraham Accords. It could encourage Iran to be tougher in negotiations. They will argue that he should leave them there for the time being. But his instinct will be if there's a way of getting them out, he'll take them out. So that will be a debate. I don't think we can predict which way it will fall, but there will always be, from Israel's point of view, the concern that at any given time he could withdraw American troops because he doesn't really care about sort of regional politics, only about the direct stuff that deals with America. And that is something that concerns both Israel and the Gulf states. And paradoxically, that's one of the things that's driving the Abraham Accords, the fear of both these groups of allies that they can't actually rely on America anymore, and therefore they better work more together in order to combat their common enemies.
Okay, I know I said I would not have any more questions, but going back to what I hear from you, actually, the first time I'm hearing it described in such terms as a sort of clever and sophisticated method of nominating people to pacify a certain party, and then in the balance between the president and the people around the president, also taking into consideration that this is his second term, so he's more unleashed, and also the fact that the Republicans are now in control of both houses. do you think all those people, Rubio, Huckabee, etc., will they still have some kind of perhaps an effect on Trump? And a second thing I would like to ask is regarding, you mentioned the transactional nature of Trump's policymaking. So still in cold terms, even though it doesn't seem very nice to say, I think Israel has more to offer America than the Palestinians in their current states. So that surely would be a consideration from Trump's perspective, no?
Yeah, so, but, you know, in terms of people around him, if it's important to the president decides and determines. But Donald Trump, and not just Donald Trump, delegate a lot of things. They prefer to come in when there's a big decision to be made. And that gives the associates, the secretaries of state, and the others a lot of room to sort of develop policy in a particular direction. And he's going to just, you know, as long as it's not absolutely opposed to what he wants, he'll just let them run with it. And at the end, he'll make a decision. You know, he's not someone who has a long span of attention. He's not someone who thinks deeply about the details of policy. He has certain instincts and he has certain goals. And that's a lot of the time enough. I think it will be much harder this time to sort of divert his attention and push policy in directions that he's opposed to. He's been president for 4 years, and he's got people around him now who are like loyal directly to him, and he cares more about that than whether they're competent or whether they know anything about what they're doing. So I think that that he will have more of a say, and he'll use their different approaches to improve his bargaining position. What was the other thing that you asked me?
The second question was, first of all, I would like to go back to another question about Qatar, but the question about whether, you know, because he's sort of a transactional leader,
Oh yes, Israel and
isn't by the nature
Palestinians.
of things, Israel, you know, it's a tech hub, it's a military, you know, we keep American whatever silos here, etc., and all that stuff.
Yeah, so look, for Donald Trump, you know, yes, that counts somewhat, but he'll look at it in the broader scheme of things, which is for him, you know, the Abraham Accords. You also have to remember that he suggested putting across the board tariffs on all trading partners, and that would really affect Israel because
Including Israel.
yeah. Now, again, would Congress allow that to happen? That's another question. They might carve out something for Israel. But, you know, Israel, you know, Israel has a massive favorable trade balance with America. It's Israel's most important trading partner. So, you know, he thinks in the transactional side of him is very much on what's good for America narrowly conceived. And he may look at Israel's high tech and say, well, maybe I don't want it to succeed. Maybe I want it all here in America. So, you know, I think that you just need to think of it in terms of how does Israel fit in with his priorities rather than what does Israel have to offer?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for this. I would like to go back to expand the question on Qatar a bit because when I mentioned the issue of funding, I wasn't just thinking about, you know, the agreement with Netanyahu asking Qatar to send suitcases to Gaza. Trump has been during the past year and a half very critical of what he called the lack of action or the lack of response of the Biden administration on what's been happening in American campuses. Now, I'm not sure this is common knowledge, but unsurprisingly, this has not been a spontaneous eruption of you know, justice warriors espousing the liberal ideals of jihad, but finding out that Qatar has been using soft power very cleverly, using social media, etc., to infiltrate American academia. And the other day, I saw former MK Einat Wilf, who undiplomatically characterized Qatar as a terror organization with a bank account. Now, America has seen McCarthy in the 50s. How come this happened now? And is Trump expected to change it somehow?
Yeah, so if we look at those separately and then join them together, Donald Trump will be acting on what's going on university campuses and what's being taught, both with regard to Israel and with regard for Republicans' general disdain for far left, what you might call wokeist politics. And the way that the vast majority of lecturers in the social sciences and the arts are actually Democrats or even left-wing Democrats. And so that is something that is a kind of easy win, because there's a broad base of people who think that what's going on university campuses in general is a problem. Also, in American law, there will be a case for what's been going on as being against anti-discrimination legislation, and that will mean that private universities could lose their tax-free status, and state-run universities could have their funding cut. And I've already noticed yesterday Harvard adopted a definition of anti-Semitism, which is considered the gold standard in the American Jewish community and is very widely respected in Israel. So I think that the universities will be on their best behavior. And I would imagine that will be something that will be picked up. The question of Qatar's role, I don't think Trump himself will get into all of that, but I think there will be people around him who deal with the Middle East and deal with education that will look into it. And if they decide to make that a priority, I don't see him saying, don't do it. He'll just say, he's not going to say, oh, well, we've got a base on Qatar and we need that. No, he'll just say, go ahead, terrify them, punish them. Yeah. And I imagine Qatar will just back off. Because they won't want to get into a fight with Trump. One of his bargaining advantages is that being an isolationist, Qatar will be worried that he might actually pull out of Qatar, and then they would be, threatened by their much bigger and larger and more powerful neighbors. The fact that they have an American base is actually an insurance policy for them. So in a funny way, Trump's sort of image as someone who's sort of mad, couldn't care less, does whatever he likes, gives him a huge amount of leverage that a normal, sensible American president wouldn't have, because nobody would believe that they would actually do these things. The fact that people in the region do believe that gives him more leverage to get what he wants.
Yes. The virtue of being completely unexpected. So in the vein of that, my last question has since the past 48 hours since he took office, have you been surprised by anything that he has said or done regarding Israel or the Middle East?
Not really, no. But I think the speed with which he enacted those executive orders tells us that he's far better prepared this time than he was last time, and that he will be far more able to do what he wants than last time around. And if we go back over the things that we've spoken about, Iran, Syria, normalization with Saudi Arabia, he won't allow himself to be pulled around so much. And you already saw that with Netanyahu, who said, well, I can't have a cabinet meeting on Shabbat, right? And then Trump says, I know you're not religious, go and have that cabinet meeting now, right? And he did. And so in a way that, that kind of extra savvy in dealing with leaders and the way that he can do a 180-degree turn on what he thinks about someone, praising Netanyahu, then cursing Netanyahu. Yeah. Those things are things that will again give him a lot more power and influence than he had last time. Whether he has the diplomatic skill to take full advantage of that, that's another question. But I think he has the skill of a bargaining person, of a negotiator, to maximize his room for maneuver. Whether he knows what to do with it or not, that's another question.
I understand. Okay, Professor Rynhold, thank you very much for this briefing. We have a few remaining questions, but we will share Professor Rynhold's contact in our members group, and you can text them directly to him. We have another question regarding whether you think Trump will stop foreign funding to universities, but we've dealt widely with Qatar in this briefing. I would like to thank you for your time. Remind our viewers this will be on our YouTube channel in a few hours. And I would like to thank Ali Naor for technically making this happen. Thank you again from me, Jonathan Beck, and thank you, Professor Rynhold, for your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, all members of the press.